Welcome everyone, thanks for joining me again on GBN Originals. My guest this morning is Ivor Cummins, who is, how to describe Ivor, he's a problem solver in the business world, coming in and addressing big complex problems. And my goodness, the world we live in today is one great big complex problem. So Ivor's the ideal chap to speak to. Thanks for joining me again, Ivor.
Oh, great to be here, Neil. Always a pleasure.
I've been keeping up with you, as I always do, watching content that you're putting out there, and I listened to you talking recently about the burgeoning mass migration challenge, let's say, complex problem that's facing Ireland, the island of Ireland, Northern Ireland and the Republic. Can you give us a sense, just first of all, before we get into the whys and the wherefores, about the direction of travel on the island?
Yeah, it is kind of crazy. I mean, I've always, since the COVID flu thing and everything, I detach myself from any emotion. And that's very important. I have a critical thinking workshop now I give online. And that's one of the key things. You've got to take out the emotion, hard as it is, in order to properly assess anything, fairly, without confirmation or cognitive bias. But anyway, so I keep the emotion out. But I must say, it's difficult with this one because I'm looking around at my country. I'm obviously native Irish. And it's just astonishing to see what's happening and the impacts. So in Dublin now, and we see on X all the time, people share videos taken on phones. But just the sheer numbers, and I don't have exact numbers, the centre of Dublin and Jenner is almost unrecognisable just over the last few years. I had a friend who's a senior executive in a medical company, and he's really doesn't engage in any of these topics. He reads the mainstream mainly. He's aware that things are crazy, but he doesn't get involved. But he told me the other day, we had dinner. He said, I was in North Dublin a couple of weeks ago, and his brow screwed up. He said, I walked around a half a mile just for the exercise as I was going to meet someone. And he said, 90% plus of the people I passed were ethnic. And he said, bizarrely, he said, this is not my country, my city. He had not been in Dublin for a long time. Now, that's a totally independent, empirical eyes on the street from someone who does not engage in this stuff. But he was agreeing that something insane is going on. So that gives you a good slice. The videos from all over the country. Someone took the census from, I think, 2023, and they made an online tool where you could look at a map of Ireland and see the percentage of Indigenous Irish. An astonishing map. So all of the cities, and especially in Kerry and certain towns where you have local money-grubbing politicians who have jumped on the bandwagon of this to make money. I saw recently in Kerry, which has been greatly affected, even though it's way down the corner of Ireland, you think, wow, that's a bit remote. Down there, 60% of local politicians, I just saw the figure on X, are gaining financially from this whole mass migration thing. 60%. So the camps are another thing entirely, which again, there's an emotional element to that when you see the footage. The drone footage shared in the last couple of months of these massive camps, I mean, they're like military barracks. They're out in the country. There's a huge one in Clonmel. I've heard the figure of 300 of them, and it wouldn't surprise me because where are you going to put all these people? But the drone footage, huge building sites with just building after building after building, like modular, huge encampments being built covertly, pretty much, by our government to simply try and warehouse the huge numbers coming in, because the city's been transformed, many towns are transformed, small villages have had protests to no avail. Everything's being transformed, and they have to build industrial level facilities to take the numbers. That's a picture for the listener. It's astonishing.
This is not what the likes of you and I, let's say our cohort, were raised to think of as migration. We've all grown up in I grew up in a mainland Britain, you grew up in an Ireland where decade after decade, here we had, a lot of arrivals from, the Indian subcontinent. We had arrivals from Africa under certain circumstances, and people arrived. Likewise, probably a different demographic were arriving in Ireland over the years, Vietnamese boat people and so on and so on. But this is something else entirely, such that, is it even accurate to describe it as migration? Immigration in the old way?
Yeah, I thought, I was in Buenos Aires a few months ago and I met Michael Yon, who's a kind of famed war correspondent in Afghanistan, and he was a Green Beret. And this guy is amazing. And he and his, I think, an Asian wife or partner, they spend a lot of time in the Darien Gap, which is a crucible where, as he calls it, the invasion of the USA all centers around the Darien Gap down near Colombia, near Panama Canal, I think. And I interviewed him, and I still haven't released the interview. So he said, why not? Well, it's not so much demonetization. It's just quite a shocking interview. And he backs up every one of his facts. But he calls it invasion. And he said Ireland is marked for a form of genocide. And that's another reason I didn't release it, because I just thought it was pretty heavy stuff to release. But I said, well, hold on a minute. And he said, look, I track the whole of the world militarily, and particularly with this mass migration, which is really an invasion. And he said, Ireland comes up repeatedly in the crosshairs. So I don't know exactly why. Maybe it's why Big Pharma took over Ireland, because it's English speaking and access to Europe. Maybe it's because of an island nation or its background, or maybe it is a prototype for this mass migration madness of sorts, as you mentioned, Neil. But he said there's no doubt all roads are pointing in a sense to Ireland. Ireland is the crucible now. And I thought, oh my God, it's kind of scary stuff. But geopolitically, from the powers that be, we won't get into conspiracy, but there are powerful players from Rockefeller down to UN, George Soros, and they're on the record. We know they're pushing this, and we know our own puppeticians would not orchestrate what I described as happening in Ireland. No way. I mean, our puppeticians are bad, but now they are truly puppets, and they are following a script. And it's the same in the UK. I mean, even the Labour Party and all the madness that they're doing with the invasion, they would not make it up themselves. It's too absurd. So it's tops down.
What is the intention then? Let's say it's an invasion. Now, I mean, it almost goes without saying, but with one thing and another, you have to say it's not the people that are on the move that are to blame.
No.
These people are pawns on a great chessboard and they're being moved. But in any event, it's an invasion. To what end? After the chaos, after the disruption, what is the intended next reality after the invasion is complete?
Yeah, and that's the killer question that people find it hard to believe that it's orchestrated for that very reason, that they can't imagine an answer to that question. It sounds like something from, I don't know, Ian Fleming or, well, worse than that. I did a diagram and it got me over to Florida to a conference, and it got me on Dr. Drew a few times, and I think on Natalie on Redacted. And one day I decided, with all this madness going on, I do a root cause diagram. And it's just a bubble diagram we use in complex problem solving. And basically I thought, I'll try and put everything down on one simple root cause diagram. And the center of it, the problem, if you will, is a globalist utopia. So just keep it simple. It's what the globalists and the higher powers want. They basically want a form of ant farm. That's my impression. They want a massive kind of internationalist blob of consumers, particularly in the West. And they want to take all the power away from democratic means and just run a form of totalitarian ant farm. So that's the problem we're facing. And then when you put in all the strategies, you've got, of course, CBDC. That would be an ultimate wet dream for them, centralized digital currency. You've got the whole COVID flu program. And we know that moved 5 trillion to the top corporates and the wealthiest 0.01%, right, away from the people. So it undermines the people. The COVID flu brought in censorship. Who'd have thought in 2019 we'd have mass censorship? Crazy, but they got it. And a load of other stuff. And then when you go around the chart, you can add in all of the sex stuff we're seeing, right? How would that possibly fit in? Well, all of the trans undermines traditional values, undermines societal structures, marriage, having children, raising children, undermines society. And I'm going to bring it to a close. Sorry, Neil, I'm going on a bit visually describing this. But all these strategies, and including the mass migration one and the anti-meat agenda, they all share one aspect, and that's undermine society and weaken society, weaken sovereignty, weaken nationalism, weaken, undermine. So I think people need to think for all these strategies, they're all going towards one thing, which is a globalist ideal, which is the kind of ant farm for us all. Okay, so we know what they want broadly. And we need to remember that undermining and weakening society and nationalism and sovereignty in individual nations is a huge enabler for that big goal. It's massive. It's what I would do, Neil. If I was sitting over this whole thing and I was a very evil man, which I'm not, but if I would make sure that every strategy with its own goals always achieved also the undermining of societal structure, because that's the great enabler of it all. If you have strong nations, sovereign nations with their own cultures, history, and you've got a diversity of nations where each nation has its own culture and music, and you can visit between them, but they're all got their own identity, kernels. How do you bring in a globalized blob of an ant farm? Answer is it's impossible. So people need to see how imperative this strategy is to weaken society. You simply can't progress your goals without doing that. And that's why it's driven so relentlessly. Migration has been used as a weapon for thousands of years. The EU published their replacement migration paper, I think in 2001, I could be wrong, lays it all out, pretends it's about declining birth rates and economics. But at the end of the day, it's driven from the top for the reasons I would say I described. And this is it, basically. So people need to just see it, ironically, a complex thing, see it a little simpler, hopefully in the way I described. It's not as complex as it seems. When you're looking at all these things happening, it just seems like insanity. But to the person running the show, and if I was running it, or my corporate guys I'm still connected to, we discussed this thing I'm discussing now, and to us it's elegant and simple. This is what you do. This is what you have to do.
You talked already about puppetitions, which is a neologism of which I am personally also very fond, because I think it's so opposite. But I grew up on, my side of the Irish Sea, you and yours. We grew up through the Troubles, one way or another, and saw them, certainly. And the persona of Ireland was of, Ireland for the Irish. And this determination to retain an identity and an independence and an Irishness, whatever your concept of Irishness might be, we ourselves, our day will come, and all of the rest of it. And it astonishes me that, the Troubles were put to rest one way or another, but that place where there was that mindset, that determined mindset, the puppetitions, and I'm thinking whatever Sinn Féin and all of the rest of it, where has that psychology gone that they just seem to roll over only for money to see all of that subverted?
Yeah, I meant in the last couple of weeks, that topic of Northern Ireland was brought up, and it just occurred to me that perhaps, and again, I don't want to sound conspiracy, perhaps one of the drivers to resolve that conflict, and you had American presidents over, I can't even remember which one, but you had all of this international attention on Ireland. And I remember at the time, I was kind of surprised they were that interested, but I guess there was the green kind of thing and the Patrick's Day parade in America, and They got some political kudos for all getting involved, but it was a tops down, let's fix this thing. And usually they don't really care too much about problems like that. There you go. I wonder now, was there a driver there that was ulterior? If you have a country that has any element of hard men and struggle and tension and nationalism, two sides of nationalism struggling against each other, there is no way on this earth that you'll pull off what's been pulled off in the last 10 or 20 years and flood the zone with people from other countries, because it would clash enormously with their belief system. So you kind of, Neil, have to clean up all that first and make everyone, dare I say it, soft and less nationalistic before you even start any invasion, you know? So I'm just hypothesizing here, that may have been one of the incentives. So America creates proxy wars all over in the East, which they do. I think they've had 100 foreign wars since World War II. The US State Department has. We know in Vietnam and Korea and all of them. And then the Eastern European countries a few years ago. They love all wars and conflict and destroying societies over there. But Ireland, yeah, kind of would have had to go the opposite way to make it soft enough to accept the mass plantation. It's a weird thought, isn't it? But I just think these guys at the top, they're long gamers beyond most people's ken. Like, people find it hard to believe that Rockefeller in the 1950s would set a path to globalism and pour massive money into it and effectively create the UN and the WHO, knowing that the prize would be long after his death. His children's children would inherit, you know, this ant farm. But this is how they work. This is how they work. They're looking decades ahead at what they want. And most normal people, they barely look to next week. Little people.
You touch on something profoundly interesting for me there, Ivor, that the whole, and you have to go back almost centuries, but a long time ago, there was a push began to secularize the West, and at root to take meaning away from people, to persuade people that you're here for however many years you get, and while you're here, grab whatever you can, because after you're gone, that's it. You know, it was a very nihilistic, materialistic replacement for any kind of faith or religion or sense of deeper meaning or spirituality. And what people, it seems to me, completely overlooked as they were duped by this bait and switch was, as you say, people like Rockefeller, just to name but one, they actually retain a deep belief.
Yeah.
While they took belief away from everyone else, they, as you say, were looking to a future that was perhaps physically without them, but that they had a vision of. So you're dealing with people of faith.
Yeah.
Of a terribly corrupted and demonic sort, but they believe in something very, very dark. And they have taken every other kind of positive belief and meaning away from as many people as possible, so as to lay the ground fallow that they might plant it, seed it and plant it and watch grow. They are planting acorns knowing that the oak trees will grow far in the future, but it's a terrible dark forest. But it's founded on deep belief.
Absolutely. And that's the kernel. And it's why they're long gamers, because they are passionately driven. I know it's pretty sick to our mind, but that is so true, what you said, Neil. They have vision. They have long strategic plans, and they fervently believe in what they're going after. And another aspect is, that's brought up occasionally, and I think there's truth in it, that at some point with the kind of internet and everyone being able to freely communicate, though that's been stamped on now, many of these elites may see some threat in their future as to the mob and the little people coming after them in some manner. It could happen. So they'd also have a self-preservation drive, which would be very powerful, to make sure they get the whole thing capped and managed so that can never happen. So no one can ever come after them or their money or their vast wealth. So that's another driver. But absolutely, I mean, Michael Yon, there's these kind of things in this that are interesting. Another reason I didn't release it was he talked about all the NGOs who are driving for many, many decades the mass migration.
It strikes me that there's an analogy with what has always happened around Switzerland. You know, this little country at the heart of things, you know, geographically and financially and in other ways, has always been left alone. You know, its neutrality at the eye of hurricanes, you know, the comparative peace in that little patch of territory while the hurricane, you know, roared all around it. Such that there's always that strange paradoxical situation where for most people are told one thing. In our time, we're being told no national identities, no nation states, you know, no heritage, no history. You know, you're here today, you're gone tomorrow. And yet elsewhere, there's a pocket where the reverse is true. Borders protected at all costs, identity protected at all costs, and all possible power brought to bear to ensure survival. You know, and something similar must have happened with Switzerland, because any one of the great powers, Hitler or anybody else, could have gone in there if they had wanted, but they didn't. And you think it's because there's a pivot point there around which everything is orbiting, and God forbid anybody of any wit should notice, but they are quite obvious when you notice it. And I think with that in mind, I ask myself all the time, because I've long been fascinated by Ireland, and I mean the island, regardless of the politics, because I'm an archaeologist by inclination, and there's so much of a story to tell of prehistory and the rest, and history on that island. And I do wonder why, as you say, Michael Yon says Ireland is in the crosshairs and all roads lead to Ireland. And I've begun to ask myself, above all else, really, why Ireland? Because in the modern setup, it's really just a small patch of mostly green ground without much in the way of, or anything really in the way of natural resources beyond arable land. Why are the globalists so intent on that little swatch of green?
Yeah, it could be just the prototyping principle that, you know, you don't bite off the elephant all in one go. And Ireland is just a perfect, manageable, proven to be easily corruptible. I mean, our politicians are traditionally, we know pharmaceutical industry came in and basically owned us a long time ago, decades ago, and the multinationals came in and owned us. And we tend to have people who rise up who'll play along for their own benefit. Now, I know all countries have a bit of that problem, but Ireland is maybe edging ahead. And it is, in a sense, a perfect prototyping facility, because if you can take the Irish, who are renowned worldwide as having a massively identifiable, you know, kind of culture, music, history, and a history of oppression and everything. And you can take that unique thing that's been exported to America with the Patrick's Day Parade in New York and all the diaspora. The Irish went all over the world, worked really hard, and tended to retain their communities and identity. Well, if you can come in now and completely destroy that, you know, that is just a perfect proof point. You know, you can just take out that. It would be very attractive. You could also say that, given what we mentioned, that most of the major NGOs who are driving this and have been for decades, as we said, they're connected to certain political, ideological beliefs. I think there's many things. It's hard to say for sure.
That's a very neat summation that you make there. You know, that everyone knows what it is to be Irish. That Irish identity, everything from the unique dancing, the terrifying rigidity of the upper body and the wild exuberance of the legs, the music, the poetry, the mythology, Cuchulainn, all of it, the Guinness, and the struggle, the determination by a faction to throw off the imperial oppressor and aggressor, all of that. As you say, if you can show under the spotlight of the world that we can take the deepest, most ingrained, most passionately held identity and we can snuff it out like a candle flame between our fingers, it's quite the statement to make.
Yeah, and it would be very demotivating for the minority who are seeing what's going on and trying to rise up to see that play out in front of them. I mean, these are, silent weapons for quiet wars. That's what we're living in the last few decades. Whatever about the hot wars, which are all proxy wars and all geopolitical scamming, and we won't even get into Ukraine. But yeah, this is how war is waged now. And the irony, again, I can't fail to see it, is when you look into the primary forces driving the problems, it's multiculturalism for thee and not for me. Because the primary forces, it appears, who are driving it are staying the most culturally, the most genetically, the most everything pure. I mean, seriously keeping and retaining no intermixing. So you have this extreme of protecting at all costs your culture, your identity, etc., while being quite heavily engaged enforcing multiculturalism, but only on them, on other people. While and Switzerland's a perfect example, we know it's the nexus or the head of the snake for the WEF and countless other banking organizations that are influencing hugely everything we're talking about from the top. But they're kept clean. And I've been there several times in the last few years. I mean, not just the mass migration, the absence of that. That's astonishing to see, for sure. But anti-meat agenda that we play out everywhere, it's the opposite. In Switzerland, they actually have strong laws that protect their cheese and their cattle. And if you drive out of Zurich, in no time you're out in the country, and there's these cows with bells on them everywhere. I mean, it's just a paradise as you go across Switzerland. There's no mass migration, no blobifying, destroying diversity, and just intermixing everything into a mess. None of that. They've got all their cattle, all their cheeses. They rigorously protect their farmers. Their farmers are almost eulogized. In Ireland, our farmers have been destroyed, and England, foot and mouth, anyone. So, yes, this hypocrisy is in our faces, and there's a lot you can read into it. Look at where the hypocrisy is coming from. And to be honest, in most cases, you'll kind of be over the target for many things.
It's astonishing to me in that Swiss context that what so many people overlook, if they're aware of it at all, is that the Bank for International Settlements sits there in Basel, whatever. Yeah. And you look at, we're invited to look at, superpower against superpower, the USA, Russia, China, whatever. 160 odd central banks around the world, including Russia, including China, including the US, they're answerable to the Bank for International Settlement. We're invited to watch these internecine squabbles between these siblings as though they matter. But where it counts, where the accounts are kept, and where the money flows, they're all answerable to the same directives coming out of one building in Basel. And the rest of most of the world just, that can't matter, but it so does.
Oh, it's huge. I mean, you've probably seen one of the structures of how the world operates, and the BIS and the banks are at the very top, and even Rockefeller, and below that NGOs and all the people clearly driving the bad stuff. They're well below the BIS. And it's true. I mean, there was the thing that any country in the world, and there were many 40 or 50 years ago, that had a government-owned central bank, They either had a war suddenly happened, or they had a colour revolution happened, or a regime change happened. I mean, it's astonishing. I'm not sure, is there any country left with a publicly owned or government central bank? I mean, literally
you've only got to look at what happened to Gaddafi in Libya.
Yeah.
For having the temerity to challenge things financial. Saddam Hussein in Iraq. I mean, look at the way in which these men were dispatched. You know, the graphic, explicitly vile and vicious way in which those men were dealt with for the crime of having said, there might be another way to transact financially that doesn't involve them. And you end up dead in a ditch with a scaffolding pole where you don't want it.
Or hundreds of thousands or more dead. It doesn't matter. For the people at the top, you said, Neil, they're amazingly driven. And that's such an important thing to keep in our minds. They are driven and will do anything because they have no morals. You do not get up to the top of the power structure. By definition, you don't get up there if you have any morals or standards. It's like, it's excluded, evolutionarily. It's impossible because anyone with morals or standards who wants the best for people or for nations or for other people, anyone with a shred of that will never make it up to the top. People need to understand this. Like in corporate, it's the same thing in corporate. All of this is an analogy with corporate politics, which I was in for decades as a manager. And it just occurred to me many years ago, this stuff is the exact same as corporate politics, which is kind of psychopathic. You know, it's the film, the corporation. It's a psychopath. But all what's going on in the world of geopolitics is the same as that. And give an example. In my corporate, there was one good vice president, pretty senior, VP level. And he was actually a good guy. And we all knew he was a good guy. And it was weird because we knew the rest of them, what they were like. And we said, how is this guy surviving? And within a year or two, inevitably, you began to hear murmurs and noises through no fault of his own. And next minute, he tendered his resignation. He was moving to do other things. He was passionate about our business. He was passionate about the employees. No question. But it was decided this guy is a problem simply because he had morals and standards. So, yeah, the people who move up to the top, you have to accept they will literally see anyone die or peoples be oppressed. Anything they have no problem with because they're only interested in the goal. They're driven. I'm often reminded of the line in the film The Usual Suspects, where the uber villain Kaiser Soze is being described what his mentality is. And the Kevin Spacey character says the baddie realised that you didn't need guns or knives or bombs. You just needed the will to do what the other guy wouldn't. Yeah.
And that's what it comes down to. And these people, there was a unilateral disarmament went on, I think, where people, most of the world was stripped, or most of the West was stripped of its faith and its spirituality and meaning in life. And the trick was, that the other side retained profound faith in what they were doing.
That's it. That is how you do it. And I believe, I won't mention which religious texts, but I was astonished to find out recently that waging war to dominate for your own tribe, actually it's advised, and this is a long time ago, 1,000 years ago plus, that you do it in that manner. You do not take people on by force if your numbers are smaller. It's even mentioned in some old religious texts that mass migration is a good tactic. Undermining culture, history, you can set people against each other and you don't need to fire a shot. Some of this stuff is written like people need to realize 1,000 years ago.
Deuteronomy, the new law, so to speak, in the Old Testament, which the three monotheisms all choose to have as the rock, is about utter destruction of the enemy. By any means, pitiless compassionless, utter destruction. And that is enfolded underpins the three great monotheisms, which has justified the colonialism and the brutalities that have been inflicted upon the New World in North and South America, on indigenous populations and all of the rest of it, were made possible and actually made divinely inspired by those stories of utter destruction.
It's shocking, and we think, oh well, it's Old Testament, so it's long ago, it doesn't happen. But it was speaking to a fundamental truth. I mean, I saw a quote recently, and I remember thinking, wow, it resonated. Benjamin Disraeli, he was British Prime Minister. He said, all of history that people hear, and I'm paraphrasing here, none of it really reflects reality or really what's going on. And he said, because historians don't understand that it's all about blood. And he said, in the end, there is only blood. That's kind of like, you wouldn't know what he's talking about. What he's essentially saying is a bit like what we're saying, that for all of our talk about multiculturalism, the real people who are driving everything, right? For them, it's about their tribe, whether it's just elitists or wealthy people, or whether it's white supremacy, or whether it's any other kind of our tribe. So all the madness we're seeing is being driven by people who are fervently passionate about their tribe versus the others. And isn't it an incredible irony that we could get called racist for trying to resist an invasion that will destroy our culture and our history? That it's being driven essentially from the top. They have a lot of useful idiots down towards our level who actually have fallen for this nonsense of multiculturalism, so-called. But at the very top, you have the most extreme racists of all who are driving it the most. They are keeping the purest, if you will. I've no interest in that myself, but they do. They want their tribe. They want to dominate. All of them. And there's different creeds up there. Some of them are just mammon. Some of them are just, they want a tribe of ultra wealthy people. They don't care what color they are to rule an ant farm. By all means, probably the Rockefellers are a bit like that. But then there are lots of other tribes, you know, who are driven more by cultural and ideological stuff.
To loop back around to Ireland, or Northern Ireland at least, there's an event coming up on Sunday the 23rd of March, I think, which is, I would say, interesting. Or do you think it's interesting? Which is a coming together across the sectarian divide between Catholic and Protestant to come together and remember the power that lies in unity in the face of what's happening in Ireland. Now, something like that by little people like you and me, do you think that can it matter?
Yeah, I think it can matter, and anything where people come together and essentially wake up to the kind of themes we're talking about. You don't have to go deep into the stuff, just get the broad idea of what's happening, and that enables you to react properly in an informed way. So it's great to see it. I don't know what the numbers will be. I mean, if it's very big, that would be amazing to see. There was a rally last June or July, I think, in Northern Ireland of a similar nature, with both sides coming together, joining against the mass migration that was ruining the society in Northern Ireland. Hopefully something will come of it and it will grow. I was on Redacted the other day, you mentioned talking about this. I don't really know the players involved, because I always try and stay as a very independent analyst of everything that's going on. And I kind of studiously avoid engaging with any different camp. And it's not because I agree or disagree with them. It's just, I must retain my independence. It's one of the cards I hold, no bias. But it's great to see it happening. I don't know how much traction it'll get. It's getting increasingly, Neil, about numbers now. Like someone sent a video the other day, when will the British actually rise up and even begin to oppose what's clearly being driven by the globalists and destroying their history, culture, and their country? I mean, at what point do people rise up? And there is a tipping point. If you get to where 10% or 15% are not just willing to speak out, but are fully willing to be called slurs like anti-V or racist or anti-S or anti... Do you know all those slurs you get called when you just try and have a discussion about what's going on and you just want to be honest, and you get these slurs coming in far right, extreme right. When you get 10 or 15% who are prepared to talk openly and are immune to those slurs, I think then we're getting somewhere.
In relation to those slurs, I mean, I've long since realised that it's not about, superpower against superpower of any of that anachronism nonsense. It's power against us. It's the people, regardless of creed and colour, any other of the fractures between peoples that can be exploited, to cause division. And that's what's really happening. And if people would stop being distracted by being invited to think it's the people either side of you that are the threat, just look to the floor above. Yeah. Look for the penthouse and ask, who's in the penthouse? Because that's where the decisions are getting made, and we're not paying any attention so far to them.
Yeah. Well, I've been saying it for a long time, absolutely. Just if people only looked upwards without all of the bias that's been put in their little peanut skulls by the mass media, who are owned by the powers above anyway. That's why they keep coming out with madness all the time. Just look upwards. And like we said earlier, look for the hypocrisy, like the Switzerland or the other examples of people who are surprisingly disproportionately driving certain things while making bloody sure they are not touched by them. Look for the hypocrisy, And the other key thing is not just to not be harsh to each other, because then they win, but there's no point being harsh to the actual migrants in this invasion. This is a strategy of globalists. It is being driven by the top, by the most racist people on our planet. Remember that. The people at the top who are driving the problem have nothing but contempt for the agents they're using, i.e. the migrants themselves. I can only imagine the contempt that the people at the top driving mass migration have for economic migrants who are low on the social scale. Can you imagine how much contempt they have? So
it's
just keep that in mind. It's not the migrant. The migrant is simply looking for a better life and is being told, come over here, we'll give you free houses, we'll build complexes for you, we'll give you X amount per week, we'll give you phones, we'll give you everything. I mean, how can you possibly blame a person for coming from a place that's a bit of a kip, when they're promised all this and NGOs are managing all of their transport and all these lovely rich people are helping us to move to a better life? There's no point blaming them. Start looking at the NGOs.
It's like you talk about the silent weapons in a quiet war. To broaden that analogy, I would say the migrants, whoever they are the cannon fodder.
Yeah,
they are the cannon fodder of that silent war. They'll be used up and cast aside, and whatever they do, the powers that ought not to be don't give a tinker's cuss.
No, and I give examples sometimes of the Iraq War. I mean, Blair was exposed as a war criminal. All the mass media covered it. Everyone knows the Iraq War was a complete conspiracy, 100% conspiracy, scam. Everyone knows that. But during it, journalists were fired in America for questioning it. And it was called a conspiracy theory to question it. So like 500,000 men, women and children, I believe, BBC did an article way back, died as a result of that scam, which was all about money and power, right? 500,000 people. The people driving all of this mass migration at the top, I would say similarly, wouldn't care a fig for any of these poor people or brown people or any of these people. We have a huge sandwich. There's massive amount of useful idiots working in these NGOs who maybe do have the ideology that, hey, this is great, but they've been propagandized themselves. I'm specifically talking about the people, the real movers and shakers at the top of the organizations. It's agenda. Clearly it's agenda. It's in our face now. It's agenda.
It's been great talking to you as always, Ivor. Thanks so much for being generous with your time. I will continue to pay attention to everything you say. Thanks for being with me today.
Thank you, Neil.